Welcome back to the Conscious Entrepreneur Podcast. I'm your host, Alex Raymond, and today I'm talking with Michele Zanini, co-author of the influential book, Humanocracy. Michele has done remarkable work on how companies can rethink innovation, corporate structure, adaptability, and leadership. Together with Gary Hamel, Michele is reshaping our understanding of what organizations can be when they're at their best. Michele is the co-founder of the Management Lab, MLab, a research and consulting collaborative dedicated to reinventing management practices. With decades of hands-on experience, Michele has helped some of the world's leading companies become more engaging and innovative workplaces. In this episode, Michele unpacks the core ideas behind Humanocracy, exploring how we can build organizations that are as dynamic and resilient as the people within them. We discuss the paradigm shift from traditional bureaucratic models to more human-centered approaches that foster creativity, passion, and accountability. Michele shares research on creating environments where everyone is empowered to contribute to their fullest, the importance of aligning with a very noble purpose, and practical strategies for maintaining entrepreneurial vitality as companies grow. I hope you enjoy this episode. Hey, Michele, thanks so much for joining us. It's great to see you.
Hey, Alex, it's lovely to be here with you.
Now, you have done some really extraordinary work around how companies think about innovation, corporate structure, adaptability, and leadership. You're the co-author of a book called Humanocracy, which first came out in 2020. And as far as I understand, you're just finishing the process of doing a new edition of the book, which is really cool. Congratulations on that. That's you and Gary Hamel working together on that work. Let's start off by understanding a little bit about what does humanocracy mean and what goes into that concept.
Yeah, well, thanks again for the opportunity to share a few thoughts. And yes, we're about a week away from delivering the manuscript, and the birth wasn't as painful as the first time around, but still glad that it's almost over. So the idea of humanocracy is really about how to create organizations that are as capable as the people inside them, that are as daring, as courageous as people can be when they're at their best. They are as resilient, they're able to bounce back from a crisis, as we often are in our personal lives, as creative as the millions of people who are on YouTube and, sharing content that sometimes gets millions of people to engage with it, and are as passionate as we can be, and we all have our hobbies, our interests, and we pursue them with a lot of gusto, right? And these capabilities that we define, who we are at our best, are seldom available or tapped in organizations, especially as they become bigger and larger. And the idea is how do you get to both and? How do you get the control, the coordination, and consistency that an organization needs to have to operate at scale in a kind of coherent way? How do you get that and the creativity, the resilience, the passion, right? Often we have to choose, but we think it's a false choice. And resolving that trade-off, this kind of apparent contradiction, requires rethinking how we manage, lead, and organize, and abandoning industrial era ways of managing, based on a completely different reality of work and people and what was required to create advantage, and reimagining that for the 21st century. So that it really is the core. Like, how do we get organizations where everyone has the opportunity and the support to contribute to their fullest?
Mm-hmm. I mean, the way that I've heard it described is, and I think this is about rethinking. It's about a change in paradigm. So it's not like we've got a new framework called humanocracy here. We're changing the way we think about the company. And it's not how can us employees or individuals be agents of the company or in service of the company. It's kind of like flipping it around and saying, how can the company be of service or be something that we are then able to work through? That's how I saw it. Is that resonating?
That's exactly right. I mean, right now there is a instrumental relationship between the organization and people. So the people are the instruments, they're resources, human resources, right?
Right.
And I don't know about you, Alex, but every time I've been in an instrumental relationship where I'm like the tool, it's not a good relationship, right? And so how do you, as you say, kind of reconceive that, that interplay, right? So people are still going to be part of organizations, but what if instead of the organization considering people tools, we use the organization as the instrument, to better our lives and the lives of the people that we serve, right? So the organization is the platform we use for impact. And it sounds like a rhetorical flourish, but if you actually take that to its full kind of logical conclusion, you get to a very different paradigm of what an organization does and how how it basically harnesses human capacity. And we can get into the details of that. But you're also right to point out that humanocracy, we use that term to contrast it to kind of bureaucracy, and we can maybe get into what that means. But it's basically the mashup of military command structures, hierarchy, stratification of roles, formal positions, and all of that, and industrial engineering, right? So all of these processes to optimize and minimize deviance and all of that, right? So basically, the love child of like Julius Caesar and Frederick Winslow Taylor, right? So they got together, they had a baby, it's called bureaucracy, and it's a system that, even though it sounds very quaint and outdated, a little bit like horsepower, and in many ways it is outdated, it's still pretty much the operating system for most large-scale organizations around the world, whether you're talking about the private sector, government, nonprofits, even like smaller enterprises, beyond a certain size, maybe 150, 200 people, they start to resemble like a mini General Motors. And so that's the system we need to kind of evolve away from. And bureaucracy, we don't have necessarily, we have a set of like high level kind of features or elements, which maybe we can get into and unpack a little bit, and a set of principles, but it's not like a turnkey solution. Here are the 20 things you need to do differently in a very specific way. It's up to every organization to find its way and its way of realizing and putting into practice these principles. So the book is really focused on principles like ownership, right? Like markets, like openness, and then thinking about like, if we were serious about these principles, what would change and how we lead, manage, organize, structure ourselves, and so on.
This is such a meaningful and timely conversation. I will share that I just had a guest on the podcast recently. It's publishing in a few weeks, Frederick Laloux, who wrote Reinventing Organizations. And so in a very similar vein, he's looking at this saying, wow, the metaphors we use, the language we use, the structures we have used all come either from military or from machines. I don't think anyone listening to this podcast wants to be thought of as a part of a machine. Like it's not our thing. And so tell us about how humanocracy is changing or enabling human flourishing at work. Like there's a really meaningful shifts that are happening. And so how are we bringing that forward?
Yeah. And I should say with Frederick, who is a friend of mine, he and I are both like reformed McKinsey consultants. So in a way, we came from a different perspectives and somehow saw the light.
Yeah,
but anyway,
I'm also a recovering MBA myself. I got my MBA from INSEAD in 2005.
All right. Yeah. Anyway, so yeah, we're all we're all expiating our sins, I guess. I don't know, but no, I have nothing against my colleagues at McKinsey. But it is a very different paradigm, even though things are changing there as well. So anyway, just a joke. So the way I might talk about this is in the context of since the audience that we're talking to, we're addressing here today, is from the field of entrepreneurship, or starting their businesses or running their business and so on. One way I like to talk about our work, our ideas is around this idea of entrepreneurship at scale, right? Yeah. And because the question I typically ask people is when think about the kind of organization where people are most inclined to give their very best. Like where we are, they're moving fast, they're stretching themselves, they're challenging conventional wisdom, right? And I think, in my experience, and I'm sure it's the same for you, I would imagine it's in a startup, right? And the advantage of a startup is less the business model and more like the people inside them, right? It's because people are kind of think their work is their passion. They're united, right, to break new ground together. Their roles are small. They're loosely defined. There are not many policies that constrain what you can do. Everybody's super accountable to the customer. Everyone, in a way, reports to the customer. Teams are small. Everybody's thinking lean. They're trying to get more with less because resources are very constrained. There are no layers, if it's a small company, how
Right.
many.
And there's usually like a big shared goal and we're all excited about something. And we also typically have pretty open lines of communication, at least at first.
Yeah. And you also have skin in the game and you have this autonomy. You feel like you can make meaningful decisions, right? So, and then, the question is, so like the way we like to think about it is like startups are kind of bold, fast, they're creative, they're free, right? And then you think about those startups and then what happens when you come back a decade or two later. And a lot of that has changed, right? You get to organizations that are much more timid. They're much more inertial. They're kind of not very creative. They're disempowering. I mean, not to name names, but it was interesting to me the shifts happening at like a company like Meta, like last year, where the Zuckerberg was talking about the fact we need to be much more efficient. Someone had did an analysis of how many layers of management Meta had, and so I think there were like 9 or 10 layers between the frontline engineer and Zuck, right? And then you contrast that with what he was saying in 2011 about the fact that we created this culture of hacking and moving fast, and we'll preserve that as we scale. It kind of didn't happen. I mean, they're still a very successful company, so it's not certainly a disaster. But you see this time and time again. I mean, in a way, Google, if you read what insiders or former insiders who have now left, and even insiders who go maybe off the record, the company's mired in a lot of bureaucracy, right? So the fundamental challenge is, how do you get that entrepreneurial spirit to remain alive and well and flourish as the company becomes bigger, right? And it is about avoiding adding those layers, adding those rules, adding the hierarchy, and finding other ways to get control. And so I can get into, if you want, a little bit sort of what are some of those ingredients, and we can talk and have some examples. But that really is the fundamental challenge. How do you preserve entrepreneurship? How do you scale it inside a company that becomes older and bigger?
Yeah, well, the way that you phrased it, that the goal is to be bold, fast, creative, and free. That's what pretty much everyone's looking for in their company and in their work, for sure.
Right. So yeah, if you want, I could kind of maybe talk a little bit about some of those ingredients are. So if you look at our companies that have mastered entrepreneurship at scale, what are some of the common elements? And I'll talk here more about some of the more practical elements as opposed to get into the principles, so to make it maybe a little bit more concrete. But one of the things that all these institutions have, and we profile, I don't know, maybe 10, 15 in the book. And they are of all kinds. We have, a Chinese appliance maker that is the largest appliance maker in the world. We have a steel maker in the US. We have a tomato processor in the San Joaquin Valley of California. So like it runs the gamut. This is kind of a model that manifests itself all over the world in all kinds of industries. But I'm going to try to tease out some of the things that, are fairly common across these organizations. And I would say the first one is, this idea that you have a very resonant, noble purpose and goals that are really stretched. So you have a mission that kind of merits the deep commitment that people have, right? And objectives that inspire them to kind of really think boldly, right? And like one good example of this for me is, we don't really talk about them in the book very much, but if you think about a company like SpaceX, and they're running circles around NASA and all the incumbents, right? And it is that their mission is to make humanity interplanetary. Like they want humans to kind of escape our ancestral planet, right? And it's kind of an amazing mission. And Elon Musk understands that unless you have a bold aspiration, you're not going to get very bold thinking, like using rockets more than once, right? That was kind of an orthodoxy that they kind of completely busted, right? And now they've taken the cost of launching cargo on to space by 90%. I mean, it's just simply amazing. And so, like you need to have aspirations that are allowing you to continue to be resourceful, because one of the problems with large organizations like a NASA, like Lockheed Martin, these competitors to SpaceX, is that they didn't do what SpaceX did. They didn't do it because they didn't have any resources. They had plenty of resources. The problem is that they didn't have a lot of resourcefulness, right? They didn't have this kind of mission that points you to think very creatively to solve the problems in a completely different way. The other thing that a mission really does is that it provides a lot of motivation and alignment. So in a way, like the mission is your boss. If everybody's united by a particular purpose that is shared, you don't need a lot of supervision. I mean, and there's, I'm going to paraphrase now this quote from a SpaceX engineer from a few years ago, where he literally broke down the chain, and it's kind of remarkable. He said something like, our mission is to become a multiplanetary species. For that to happen, we need to colonize Mars. For that to happen, we need to build Starship, our heavy lift rocket. To build Starship, we need a more powerful engine. To build an engine, we need to build a particular valve assembly, and it needs to work in a particular way. And my mission is to optimize the performance of this valve, right? So complete line of sight between the purpose and what the person was doing. And so that's kind of an extreme example, but that's what these companies do. They substitute management with this kind of very resonant goal and objective. So you don't have to have someone breathing on your neck. Are you delivering on your mission? Are you delivering on your goals? Because you're there's almost like this intrinsic motivation, right? To apply yourself in the best possible way. So that's one big feature. And now just stop me here anytime with your thoughts or questions. So I don't want to make this a monologue.
So the first ingredient is have a big mission that everyone can rally around and get aligned behind. So we're all focusing on something big. It's exciting. We want to help make it succeed.
Right.
What comes after that?
So I'll give you two first. So the two additional ones are, everybody's kind of accountable to the customer, and they have like a real world kind of a marker of performance that they can kind of be held accountable for, and typically that comes in the form of a P&L. You're not managing synthetic KPIs that are derived, and you're managing something that is essential, and for which, like, if that thing doesn't kind of work, it's like there are no excuses. It's like kind of on you, right? And there was one friend of ours, the chairman of SAP, Snabe. When he kind of left the firm, he talked about the fact that they had like 5,000 KPIs running, for running SAPs, and he was like, he wasn't bragging. He was thinking this is like a bad thing, right? We basically felt like we could deconstruct everything and into these metrics, and then kind of aggregate things back up. And that might be true in a steady state world, but that's not the world we live in. And he says, this is kind of crazy. We kind of put our brains on ice, right? So, what is it that you can do in your business to just create, true accountability for the customer, and P&L accountability if you can, right? And so one example of this that is kind of interesting, and I'll spend a couple minutes on it, if you allow me, Alex, is Haier. So I mentioned them before. They're the largest appliance maker in the world. They own GE appliances in the US, and they're based in China. And they've been at this kind of amazing journey of organization transformation when their now retired CEO, Zhang Ruimin, basically said 20, 30 years ago, I want to create an organization where everybody is a CEO, where everybody's an entrepreneur. And because I want everyone to report to the customer. So we talked earlier about reporting to the mission. His idea was everybody needs to be reporting to the customer. That's the source of control and motivation, right? And so what he did is he created a company where, let's think about the Chinese operations for a second. There are about 60,000 people working there. They're organizing to micro enterprises. So you have little businesses that are, some of them are customer facing. They need to bring a particular refrigerator to the market. But others are like manufacturing, designing, purchasing, logistics, and all these micro enterprises come together through internal contracts But basically put them, align them around a particular target, a particular mission, and a particular set of activities and priorities. And it's a process that is quite dynamic. So and if you don't perform, like, you can get fired, and there are you can choose from different factories, from different design nodes. And everybody has a P&L. So even the factory, they need to kind of, they produce something for a product micro enterprise, they will get paid for that, right? And so, and there are very few allocations. It's very true. And they have ways to making sure this isn't cumbersome, which we can get into if you want. They have a little platform that allows the contracting to be relatively straightforward with, preset benchmarks for certain services and whatever. But basically, the whole company is a network of micro enterprises that comes together in a very voluntary way, and where there are no internal monopolies. So, like, I've talked to a lot of HR folks who tell me, "Oh, Michele, like, we're so focused on our internal customers." And my question to them is, like, can they fire you? Because if they can't, they're really not your customer, right? They're kind of your hostage.
It doesn't count. It doesn't count unless there's that accountability.
Yeah. And so like, basically, like, if you're HR and you provide services that are not good or whatever, you go out of business, someone wants to work with you. And so there's all this pressure, healthy pressure to just deliver value constantly, right? And you typically get paid in part, even if you're like a back office, like a factory or whatever, you get paid in part on how well does your refrigerator does on the market. So, like, you're not just getting paid because you did your job relative to the contract, but you're exposed to the success in the marketplace. So, like, literally, as he said, everybody reports to the customer. So it's kind of a radical model. You would think it's like it doesn't work, but they're very, very successful, and they're now exporting variants of this even to GE appliances in the US. So those are the other two things. So we talked about noble purpose, report stretch, and reporting accountability relative to the mission, and then we talked about accountability relative to the customer, and having something fundamental that gauges your performance, right? Not some sort of KPI. So those are super important.
Yeah.
The others, I'll give you another two, kind of to build on top of this, is that all these organizations that we've profiled are basically run by collections of teams. So they're very disaggregated. So these operating units are no more than 50. And the teams, I kind of alluded to this earlier with Hire, have the autonomy to make critical decisions. There isn't like a central function, a center of excellence or whatever that tells them what they can do. They manage the P&L, they make the big calls. And they also, we'll get to this a little bit later, they also stick with the consequences. They have to bear those. But it's this idea of making the organization smaller as it grows. So, like, you want to become big on the outside, you have to become small on the inside. So we talked about Hire and their 4,000 micro businesses. Another one like that is Vansi. They're like one of the largest providers of construction services, infrastructure build outs, and they also manage highways and airports and the like. They have about 300,000 people across the world. And like Hire, they're organized in little small units. And the interesting thing about these units is that when they become of a certain size, so like I think it's maybe 100, they split. It's like cellular division. And I was talking to an executive there in their energy business, because they do a lot of energy projects, and he was saying, when the test is like, does the business unit manager know everyone in the organization? If not, it's too big. You want to keep it human scale. So there's this personal connection between everyone. Everybody feels like, Gore is another one that W. Gore, the makers of Gore-Tex and a bunch of other things, including guitar strings, they have a similar test, which is like when people start saying they decided, not we decided, that means that unit has become too big. So there's this sense of disaggregation, and and it's also a great way to start new ventures, new businesses. It's not something like I mentioned, the concession business, which is now maybe $5-6 billion. It started with some person in the organization saying, "Hey, we inherited this airport and we bought other assets in Cambodia. I'm gonna go run that and I'm gonna turn it into a business." And And he was like, yeah, start a new micro business, do that. We'll give you some support, but then it's kind of up to you. So it's that vitality that you get. Like the more monolithic an organization is, the less vital it is, right? The less resilient it is. It's the small things that move fast, and so.
So let me ask about the leadership mentality that has to change in order for this to work. And so if we say, okay, here are all the ingredients for success. We've got a great vision. We've got smallish teams where everyone knows each other. Yeah. We've got accountability to the customer. What are the leadership changes that have to make? I know that you've talked a lot about, make everyone a leader every day, for example. Yeah. And we don't want to just have leadership confined to the top echelons of the company. Mm-hmm. We want to cultivate a totally different leadership mindset across all the different levels, giving everyone the opportunity to lead and to innovate. What's your view on how we need to rethink the role of leadership in these companies?
Yeah, that's a great question, because in a way you need to change both the organizational model and then the leadership model, right? And I think the biggest shift on the leadership model is that we need to go back to basics and think about what leadership means. So leadership to me means multiplying the capacity of the people you work with and the organization and making amazing things happen. You spot new opportunities, you solve a difficult problem, you rally people around a particular cause. Those are what I would imagine, leadership means. Being very entrepreneurial and having people follow you, being willing to follow you. Leadership, and Gary and I, as we were writing the book, we said, we even consider not even using that term at all because it's become so corrupted by and conflated with administration and management. And so leadership is almost, it's in most organizations, is a correlate of where you sit in the hierarchy. There are leaders are the people at the top of the organization, right? But when I ask a team, of people, who's the leadership team, in your company, they would point to the C-suite. But
right. It's the org chart, or it's what I think you call positional power, right?
Yeah, and the problem is that when you create an organization that is basically an aristocracy of administrators, where the way you get ahead is by become better at managing a budget or setting a plan or monitoring a process, you select for those kinds of people that aren't very entrepreneurial, that are, will guarantee you probably some modicum of performance, but will also probably not give you outstanding performance or standout performance or reinvent the core of the organization and pursue new opportunities. I mean, you need to select for and evaluate and reward leadership in the original sense of the word that I mentioned before, right? So where correlate, compensation and influence doesn't matter on where you sit in the hierarchy. And by the way, where there aren't that many rungs of that ladder for you to climb, right? In all these organizations, you have maybe 4 leadership levels or hierarchy levels. So you're not basically trying to just, I'm going to do this and play it safe this year so I get my promotion next year. There are not that many promotions to begin with. And the promotions are really given based on, are you entrepreneur? Did you start a new business? Did you do something amazing for the customer? So you almost need to completely change the way you hire people, but then also the way you evaluate and hold people accountable. And it's less about, being a competent administrator. Of course, that's important, but it's only one of the many skills you need, right? And one of the things that infuriates me is that we talk the good game when it comes to leadership, but when you look at what we're actually doing, is we're not really rewarding that leadership that matters. And so I think that needs to change.
And how does that relate to, one of the things that pretty much everybody universally hates, but we do it anyway, which is performance management and performance reviews?
Yeah. Yeah. There's in the new version of the book, we have a table with 10 different lines of evidence on how performance management is fundamentally broken. It's not just the employees on the receiving end that hate it. It's the HR folks themselves who think it's useless, and the executives who basically there's no correlation between performance ratings and actual value added. It's a huge time suck. And it's a good example of a process that has remained stuck, and somehow we all realize that it's broken, but somehow we can't muster the courage or the imagination to think boldly about how you change it. And I realize that it's hard, right? Because to change performance management, you got to change more than just that little process that you do every year. You got to change the entire, in a way, institutional context around it, right? So the way, so I'll give you an example of how this works at Gore. Very interesting. So Gore, I mentioned before, they're a large private company started by Bill Gore in the 60s, I believe, to create an organization where that fosters that natural leadership I was mentioning before. I mean, literally, that was I want to create an organization where no one has to take an order, where people commit things to each other, right? And that's how work happens. You make commitments, and it still works that way. It's amazing. It's about 10,000 people, so it's become quite big and successful. Anyway, so the way they do, and there's no real hierarchy in traditional sense. I mean, there are people who are leading teams, but they're people that people want to lead. And they've established themselves, they have credibility. Because, by the way, I'm not against hierarchy. I think hierarchy is important. I mean, some people will be better than others in certain things, right? So, sometimes our argument or the arguments of Frederic gets a little bit trivialized that way. Oh, you're just thinking about like bossless organization where everyone can do whatever the hell they want. No, actually, there's still hierarchy, there's still discipline, but you get it in a different way. So here's how accountability works. Because one of the things you want performance management to do is maybe two things. One is you want to reward performance, right? And align compensation with impact. The other thing you want to do is, create some sort of accountability. Are you doing the things that are actually not just good for you, but adding value to the firm? So the way this works at Gore is through a process of peer review. So you work as a Gore person on many teams during the course of a year. So you build exposure to a lot of people. So at the end of the year, this is what happens. So someone basically, let's say that there's Alex and Michele and Jane, right? So we both work with Jane, right? And we put Jane as sort of someone that has worked with us. So then Jane is presented with both of us. And it's a pairwise comparison. They've changed it recently so that it's this way. And they say, who's added more value to the firm this year, Alex or Michele? And I'm sure it will be Alex in our case. But
certainly hope so. I certainly hope so.
Yeah, I think so. But it's not like some sort of multidimensional competency grid, whatever, right, with 5,000 different things you need to check off. It's like, who added more value? And the thing is that they do that. They do that pairwise comparisons for hundreds of people that you worked with, or tens of people you worked with. So basically, the mechanism then builds out a hierarchy of contribution based on what peers have said about you.
Yeah.
And
then this is contribution to the company. It's contribution that we all agree on the definition of what a contributor is. So we see the impact that he or she is having. So we can all do that. And this is vastly superior to the traditional way of doing performance management, which is here's a 360-degree review thing that you've got to do against 10 people and 14 competencies and 7 skill areas. And it takes you 45 to 60 minutes per person and you go completely crazy.
Yeah. And then, of course, it gets calibrated. So, you don't want distribution to be completely out of whack depending on where geography, function, whatever. So there are committees that then take this input and make sure that it's sane, but it's definitely driven first and foremost by your peers, and it determines like your performance rating, but then also your compensation, right? And so this is like, as you say, it's a very powerful system and also more efficient. That alters behavior profoundly, because yes, we said earlier. That Gore is all about you. No one can tell you to do things. You need to make a commitment, right? And so this will motivate you to make the right commitments and follow through on the commitment, right? Because the person on the other end will review you, and if you're like screwing around and not doing things that are really stretched and really important to advance the firm's agenda and performance, no one's going to give you credit for that. You can't hide. Right. And it also takes the politics out of it, because if you have one boss that is doing the review, maybe you got like a couple other people who are like colleagues that are doing the 360, whose ego to massage and stroke, right? Who with whom you can play politics and praise and whatever. If you're getting reviewed by 30 people, like, you got to be collaborative and you can't be political. So anyway, that's just one example. of how you can reimagine. There are lots of others, but of how you can reimagine. So how performance gets assessed. I mean, in the case of, by the way, Hire or Vinci, I mentioned earlier, the performance is very clear. Are you hitting your numbers or not? Like, are you making money or not? Right? Again, no multidimensional. Like, you have a P&L. Are you profitable? And if not, tell me why. Maybe you have a good reason. But
there is absolutely nothing wrong with using that as a measure. Like, that is the measure. And instead of having 5,000 KPIs, we have one or a very small number. Then cool.
Right. Yeah. And, so like the truer, the less gameable the metrics of performance, and the less gameable and more robust the sources of input, the truer and the more efficient will be the performance management exercise, right? And I guess you don't, again, at least maybe to our audience this sounds like fantastical, or like, oh my god, like how can I operate this in my unit at or my organization? The one of the things that we stress in the book is that you can have radical kind of goals, but you need to get there through experiments and prototyping. Just like we're all fans, I'm sure, of the lean startup,
agile,
agile, all of that. The huge disconnect from me, Alex, is that we understand that when it comes to products and services, we need to prototype, we need to be hypothesis driven, blah blah blah. But when it comes to like something like performance management or budgeting or planning, we're like, oh my god, we got to reinvent it like in whole cloth and implement it all at once. No, you can be as experimental and scrappy,
right?
And run experiments. And if you want, I can give you an example or two. But these are things you can totally try out. You can run them in parallel with the old. You can use volunteers in a part of the organization, and de-risk this so you maximize kind of learning as you do this. And that really is my appeal. Like think of this as sort of the organizational equivalent of a lean startup.
Yeah, got it. Let's shift here for a second. I want to talk about something that you write a lot about in the book, and that your work and Gary's work really reflects, which is bureaucracy or stasis. And what I want to get at is, like, when does bureaucracy start to set in? So I've got a company, it's going great. We're moving. You gave examples of some successful companies earlier. We get to a certain size and scale, and then innovation slows down. We start to get more bureaucratic, more processes, more stuff happening. When does that typically start to set in? How can we see the early warning signs? What can we do about it?
Yeah, I think, we call it bureausclerosis. It's like some sort of disease that happens with age as companies get older.
Yeah, well, you guys also have that hilarious bureaucratic mass index, the the other BMI.
Right. Yeah, which, by the way, people can, maybe we can put this on as a link. You can take this little survey. It's 10 questions, won't take you very long, but they will assess sort of how bureaucratic you are, and you'll be surprised if you're a smaller firm, your BMI is lower, right, than you are at a large firm. But there's a whole distribution, so you can kind of compare yourself to others. But it is a natural. It's not natural. It's not inevitable, right? Because we've seen exceptions for sure. But it's sort of what happens when you just like are not particularly diligent at sort of reversing it. So I would say, if you had to kind of press me on, at what point do you start to get bureaucracy growing faster than the organization? I might say like over like 1,000, 2,000. That's when you start to see a bit of an inflection point where, the curve goes a little exponential. But, what happens is that, you have, you just have more people. And even if you keep the same span of control, you need more managers to manage more people. And then those managers need to be managed by others, right? And those people need to be managed by others. And so that's how, by the way, Meta got to like 10 layers, right? So you're just adding people as you grow, and then you're also then adding a lot of HR, finance, other people who then not only count as more overhead, but then they add, what do? They issue policies, requirements. You need to fill out this report, that thing, and so you start to create more sludge. And I'm not saying that all of that is useless, or so by the way, some of it is also externally imposed. So it's not all internally driven, but a lot of it is. processes become more elaborate. It's really hard to then almost like reverse them, right? It's kind of a ratchet, and there's like it only goes one way, right? You have interdependencies that multiply, so you need to create more czars who deal with that particular interdependency, or work groups, whatever, and then rules in a way they typically don't have a sunset clause, and so they kind of sediment, right? And so you just have more and more of them over time, and soon enough you get to a situation where you have organizations that are very healthy, that are very kind of sclerotic. And so, how do you avoid that? I mean, I think first of all, and maybe the BMI is a way you can kind of gauge some of this, but you need to be absolutely explicit about the costs that bureaucracy imposes on the organization, because the problem is we don't really have many metrics to do this, right? We can quantify efficiency gains when we centralize, right? But you think about that decision. Let's centralize X, at this pricing or whatever, or brand management or whatever. You can quantify, okay, what it would cost in terms of saving headcount in the different business units that used to do that separately. What you don't necessarily, you can't quantify very easily is, what does that do to our ability to respond quickly to customer needs, to change maybe in the brand perception, in being flexible and being adaptable, right? Those things are not really, don't appear on a P&L. I mean, eventually they do, because you will miss opportunities, but that might be like 2-3 years down the road, while the efficiency savings you can measure right away. So like, what are some of these metrics? And so this BMI thing is one. I mean, you can also do this in a more kind of a qualitative way, where one of the things I've seen done very effectively is that you can ask every manager or every team leader periodically to do the following things. First, have conversations with their team about, and you can do this, by the way, also like as a group, if it's not a large firm, but just think about it. What is the things that you see in your day to day, right, that blur and reduce accountability? They slow you down, they waste time, they really don't contribute to the customer impact. They frustrating bold thinking that encourage you to be very conservative, that reduce flexibility, that impede collaboration. What are those things? And do a regular kind of diagnostic or audit what people are saying. And I think the farthest away you get from headquarters, the better, because those are kind of on the receiving end of all those things that do that, right? And then ask them, like, what is it, one thing or two things that you think we ought to do to remove this barrier to entrepreneurship achievement, and so on. And so being very systematic, being very diligent at unearthing where we're creating these spots of dysfunction, and then being very systematic about removing them. I think that is the way you're able to scale without that sclerosis that we talked about earlier.
When I think about this, it's almost built into the vocabulary of how we build a business. It's almost built into the model. So what I mean by that is, when I think about a lot of the folks I know who have built companies and grown companies, what happens? Well, you raise money as you go, and you raise money, and one of the first things the investors say will be something like, well, we've got to bring in the grown-ups, right? We have to bring in the grown-ups to do sales, or to do, whatever it is, to be a COO, kind of thing. So right away, first of all, just in the lingo that we're using, it's an old school lingo, right? Meaning you don't know what you're doing. We need people who are serious. So right away, and what do those people do? They bring in structure, process. Here's how we did it at my old company. Here's how we did it at IBM when I worked at IBM, or whatever. And this stuff like immediately drains us. We think that we're doing it because we're growing up as a company, but in reality, we're just adding a lot of bureaucracy. And so my guess is, in your research, you're also finding that moments of those step stages of growth, so going public or raising more capital or making an acquisition, are big changes in terms of bureaucracy. Another one that I bet is like CEO transition or founder transition, when he or she says, okay, I'm stepping down. They very rarely go for, unless the company's 50 years old, they very rarely go for somebody younger and less experienced than they are. They almost always go for someone who's older and more experienced than they are, all of which I would guess is contributing to this problem.
Yeah. Gary has, my partner, Gary has nice way to frame it, that, basically you have like 3 generations in a company. You have the maker, you have then the caretaker, and then you have the undertaker, right? um, and it's kind of probably unfair, and it's I'm sure not always true. But yeah, when you kind of the entrepreneur kind of leaves the reins, often leave them to someone who is a professional administrator who is very competent, but isn't necessarily going to build anything new. And I do take your point that there are constraints once you operate a certain scale, or especially if you tap into the public markets, that bring a lot of bureaucracy. You just cannot avoid it. Like, so if or you feel like you can't, but I think you can. I mean, I'll just give you a super quick example. So one of the companies we profile in the book is a bank called Handelsbanken. They operate in Northern Europe, UK, Sweden, Netherlands, and the like. They're the most profitable bank, have never been bailed out, super responsible. And they're organized, like, I think they have 2 layers of management, and they have 400 branches or something like that. And each branch is completely, like, they have their own P&L. I mean, very much like what we discussed earlier. And that goes against any kind of regulator conception of what proper risk management is. Right? Proper risk management requires a centralized unit that does all the risk management. They do all the compliance. They set all these limits. They have all these rules, and sort of they lock things down. And they've demonstrated that no, actually, if you make the branch manager not only responsible for extending the credit decision, but in making it, but also being they're like having the skin in the game. That so if the loan goes badly, they're on the hook. So they're not going to make stupid decision. They're not going to kick it upstairs to some debt workout department. It's their loan to figure out how to solve, and maybe write off if they can't, right? But so they found a way to have that kind of both end that we talked about earlier. So they are highly responsible and highly entrepreneurial. And I think that is the challenge to the founders and the entrepreneurs that might be listening to this. Like how do I figure out a different way of managing this trade-off that doesn't require the grown-ups to come? Because the grown-ups might kind of make things stable and guarantee some performance, but they're more likely to deliver mediocrity than they are, to continue on this whatever entrepreneurial run you've been on. I mean, again, these are kind of maybe blunt and a little bit exaggerated statements, but I think that is kind of the general ethos. And so the challenge is, can you be as entrepreneurial in managing and envisioning your organization so that you can deal with the complexity in novel ways? And it's how do you want control, but how do you get the control without all the bureaucratic stuff?
Awesome. Well, hey, wrapping up here, what do you think an entrepreneur should do if they're just starting out? They want to make sure they're as resilient, innovative, adaptable, and human focused as possible. What are the critical decision points for them, and what's the mindset they need to be bringing into this?
Yeah, I mean, I might just sum it up as sort of, how do I give everyone in the team or the organization maximum autonomy and maximum accountability? If I had to kind of boil it down to the very essence, it would be that. And then how do I enable that? How do I create an organizational environment where that is encouraged and flourishes, right? So there's, you can specify some of that by wiring the organization in a particular way, but there are also things you need to do. So, for instance, how do you give everyone the competence to make the right decision for the business? So it's not just about empowering them and making them accountable, but do they have the tools? Do they have the information? One of the things that I've seen often happen in organizations of all scale, including the wonderful example we don't have in the book, SRC Holdings, it's called. I'll share the link with you, Alex, and you might want to put it in the show notes. But they're a company, not very big, where every employee, including blue-collar workers, knows exactly how the business works, the economics of the business, makes sense can read the P&L, can read the balance sheet. And with that information, they understand, like, decisions they make on inventory or pricing, whatever, how that impacts the overall business. So there are certain things that that an entrepreneur or CEO can do to give people the tools, information to be maximally accountable and autonomous. But those would be the kinds of things, creating an organization without bias, and then supporting people so they can thrive in that kind of an environment.
Fantastic. Well, Michele Zanini, thanks so much for being here. I really appreciate the journey through human potential, humanocracy, and avoiding bureaucracy. Thanks so much for joining us.
Thank you so much for the opportunity, Alex.